Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jerry Renaud. On this episode, Doug Simon gives his analysis of corn and soybean markets. Bruce Anderson explains how high temperatures can cause alfalfa to become misleading for harvest. Keith Glewen shares information on the upcoming soil health clinic, and Bob Wright talks about Japanese beetles. Doug Simon from Tredas is our market analyst this week. According to the July USDA World Agriculture Supply and Demand Estimates report, the national average corn yield will remain at 174 bushels per acre, and the 2018-19 corn production forecast is 190 million bushels higher. In addition, stocks were lowered 25 million bushels. The agency reports that corn is silking, and the critical pollination period is predicted to occur during middle and late July. For soybeans, according to the WASDE report, the recent tariff that China placed on U.S. soybeans is predicted to cause higher prices for soybeans in China. The 2018-19 global soybean supply and demand forecasts include higher production and lower trade and crush compared to last month. Lower demand and a year-over-year decline in stocks for China are forecast to result in an 8 million ton decline for imports and a 6.8 million ton decline for U.S. exports, which is partly offset by a 2.1 million ton increase for Brazil. We talked with Doug on Thursday to learn more about the WASDE report, but began by asking him about the latest crop progress report.
On Monday, crop conditions came out and we had corn rated at 75% good to excellent. It was down 1 point. Beans were at 71. They were the same. Those were very, high rated crops, some of the best we've had in history. And for the most part, that's what, when you look around the country, that's what it looks like around Nebraska. We have pretty good, situation. Obviously a little bit of dryness in kind of southeast Nebraska and across northern Missouri, southern Iowa, over toward kind of the western, southwestern part of Illinois. But when you look at the big overall crop, conditions as good as they are, we had the WASDE report out on Thursday afternoon, and a lot of expectations were for that crop maybe going from like a 174 bushel yield up to maybe a 180. USDA kept that crop size the same at 174 and didn't boost it up, and so that was encouraging to the corn market on Thursday.
Let's talk a little bit about the WASDE report. What are some of the other numbers that came out that you found interesting?
Well, we knew they were going to bump up the acres based on the June acreage and stocks report, and they bumped that up. And when you look at the bottom line on corn and looking at carryover, we actually dropped the carryover just a little bit. We boosted our exports for this last year for our old crop. We boosted exports on corn for new crop, which is good. They cut the feed and residual a little bit and cut some ethanol a little bit, but the bottom line is instead of going up to like a 1.7 or 1.8 bushel or billion bushel carryover, we actually dropped it a little bit and kept it just under 1.6, which is encouraging for corn. On the soybean side, with all the talk about trade going on, that was where the big questions were going to come in. We basically cut the Chinese imports of soybeans from about 103 million metric tons down to 95 million metric tons. So that's a pretty substantial drop. Cut U.S. soybean exports by 250 million bushels. So when you looked at the soybeans balance sheet, we boosted the carryovers there in the U.S. about 195 million bushels and put those numbers above expectations, above the trade guess by about 100 million bushels. So those bigger numbers on the soybean side, and prices, interestingly enough, were up a few cents after the market opened up. They were down 2 cents when I left the office here a little bit ago, and corn was up 5. So actually the report, overall wasn't too damaging. There was a lot of negativity going into the report, and so it was nice to see it kind of be a little quieter in terms of reaction to it.
So no real surprises in the report?
I think the big surprise, the big question is just what's going on with China and what's the trade, how's that going to impact their import level? And I think what the USDA is saying, they're going to drop, from that 103 down to 95, maybe quantified it in people's minds a little bit. When you look at those world numbers, though, on corn, that's encouraging as well, because we came down from a 230 million metric ton number on the world corn numbers down to, closer to 200 million, and now we're dropping down towards 155 million metric tons on the corn. that number has dropped where we've got carryout stocks or days of use or days available down to levels we haven't seen, for over 20 years. And so the corn balance sheet longer term is actually encouraging. We've got an abundance of beans in the world, and if you look at the wheat side of it, the wheat market side of it was pretty quiet in the U.S., but we actually cut like 9.6 million metric tons from the world numbers on production. We actually cut the stocks by about 6 million metric tons, but when you look at the overall wheat side of it, the world exporters, those numbers have tightened up. They're as tight as they've been since 2007. So when you look at corn and wheat stocks, they've tightened up a lot worldwide. Beans are abundant, so longer term you would think those would be a little more supportive versus the beans.
You mentioned the trade issue with China. There's also the trade issue with NAFTA that is a concern. What do you tell people when they ask you about this?
It's interesting. We were in Chicago for R.J. O'Brien, is our Futures Commission merchant that we work with, and we had meetings up there 2 weeks ago, and the chief ag negotiator, Greg Dowd, was there. And he said NAFTA is all about cars, and he said China, from an ag standpoint in their trade, they're really going to put their interests first. And so when you look at, when you look at that trade thing, Dowd said that Trump's the one that's in charge on this, and he's not giving this up to an undersecretary. He's, really trying to push bilateral negotiations, and he said that he's really taken the view that he wanted to be on the offensive. So longer term, I view it as positive because I view, freer and fairer world trade as being positive, not only for our economy, but for the world. And so, yeah, it's given us a lot of disruptions right now, which are not fun. But when you look at the prices of corn and beans, when you looked at where we were in the springtime and you use projections, based on the potential for the crop size that we raise and with acres, we're really at those levels where those prices would have projected if we had good crops. We went through the same pattern about this time last year, and so it's not somewhat unexpected in terms of have this big a drop-off.
The last time you were on the show, you talked a little bit about market volatility. Some of that is still there. What are your recommendations?
Well, the markets are always uncertain. So from our perspective, we always like to do pre-harvest marketing of selling corn and soybeans. And when I was here in mid-May, talked about being 60% sold of our insurance guarantee, and we went through a pretty typical seasonal decline. It happened a little bit earlier than it typically does, and so trying to get those last couple increments were harder to do this year. But going forward, we're glad that we've sold what we've sold. And when I talked about earlier some of the fundamentals that are going on, I think there'll probably be some opportunities on corn. I think to sell. Down the road, we've got a long marketing horizon ahead of us to, sell stuff that we haven't sold yet. But the basis opportunities are interesting today because when we were sitting here 2 months ago, really thought that there'd be a lot more corn moving in this time frame and the basis levels would be a lot wider. And so it's nice to see that we're moving a lot of corn like out of southern Nebraska down into Kansas. And that probably, if that stays a little drier in northeast Kansas, that'll give us some opportunities also for new crop basis opportunities to be better than they were last year, not only because that market's tighter, but because those world numbers are tighter on the corn side.
Next week, Elaine Cubb will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. With temperatures consistently in the 90s, heat can be a major influence on plant growth. According to Nebraska Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson, alfalfa can bloom early in these hotter days, but that doesn't mean it's ready for harvest. We sat down with Bruce on Monday to learn more about when to harvest alfalfa in higher temperatures.
Well, certainly this is a pretty opportune time to talk about high temperatures because we've been experiencing those days in the 90-degree range and above, and evenings that don't get below 70 degrees. And I think anybody who's experienced those kind of temperatures themselves recognize how uncomfortable it can be for us. Well, certainly the plants that are out there in the field, they're experiencing it maybe even worse than we do. And alfalfa is no exception. In fact, alfalfa may have some particular characteristics in the high heat that we have to be more knowledgeable about and recognizing how it reacts to that high heat. For instance, when the temperatures get real high like they have been lately, alfalfa tends to show its maturity much more quickly. Now, typically we may have a harvest interval planned of maybe 28 to 35 days between each cutting. But when we start getting temperatures like we've been experiencing recently above 90 degrees, it's not unusual to see that alfalfa starting to bloom in 25, 21. I've seen it even within 18 days after cutting. And while we think that that bloom then may indicate to us that the alfalfa is ready for harvest, in fact, it's very misleading because it actually takes the alfalfa more time to really fully recover from the previous cutting when it's real hot than when we have maybe more mild conditions for those alfalfa plants. It just misleads us with how fast it shows that bloom.
And one of the concerns is the heat at night.
That's right. The heat at night is part of the real problem, that the alfalfa plant never really gets to maybe recover from that daytime heat. It has that nighttime high temperature, and it keeps on metabolizing faster and faster the warmer the temperatures get. And this faster metabolism is part of the factors that influence that rapid maturity. And so one of the things that really can mislead us with that early bloom is if we follow that bloom and harvest that alfalfa after maybe only 20 days of recovery. One of the things we see is that the alfalfa plant has not replenished its nutrient reserves in the root and crown. And that's what the alfalfa plant uses in order to initiate and recover with its regrowth. The plant needs to have excess amounts of the carbohydrates and the proteins that it produces during the day in order to start building those additional reserves. And when it's hot out, the plant just simply doesn't have that excess amount. And so instead of taking a normal time really for the alfalfa plant to reach that point where it is fully recovered from our previous cutting, it actually takes longer than it normally would, rather than the shorter time that it seems to indicate by that fast bloom.
So what recommendations do you make for decisions about doing the harvest?
Well, I think the thing that we probably need to do is kind of keep track on the calendar of when we took a harvest, and recognizing that if the temperatures are high, we have to kind of ignore when that bloom occurs and instead look at the calendar and say, well, normally I'm going to take a harvest in 28, 30, 35 days, something like that, and hold off until that time, no matter what the plant might be showing us, so that we do give the plant at least adequate time to be prepared to regrow rapidly for us after that cutting.
Now, there's also a concern about the value, is there not?
There certainly is. You know, as that alfalfa plant is getting more mature, it's getting more stemmy, it's doing it faster because of this high heat. Of course, the feed value is going down. Not only, though, is the feed value going down because of that rapid maturity, but the high heat also tends to cause the plant to kind of burn out its good nutrients. High temperature forces the plants to use especially the carbohydrates that it's producing with photosynthesis. The sugars, the starches, those types of compounds that are really valuable to the animals that will eventually consume that alfalfa are going to be missing from the alfalfa plant because the high temperature causes that plant to burn them out, both during the day and especially during the high temperature nights that are ahead there. So it's not unusual for us to harvest alfalfa that's been growing in high heat, take a test of that alfalfa to see what its nutrient content is, and we might have high protein because all those carbohydrates have been burned out, so it tends to concentrate the protein. We also have high fiber in that alfalfa plant, which typically is considered undesirable. And so we have low energy value from the alfalfa. It kind of confuses us a little bit as to why do we have high protein, which we consider good, but we have very poor digestibility and energy, which we would consider bad. And it's because the energy has been burned out of the plant and the protein and the fiber has been left behind to be more concentrated.
In order to gain the most from harvesting alfalfa, Bruce says to give plants extra time between summer harvests in order to maintain healthy plants. Soil health can have a large impact on a grower's yield. That's why it's important to know both what can affect the soil and how to test it. Nebraska Extension educator Keith Glewen believes it's important for growers to understand the components of the soil in order to better utilize and protect it. Keith joined us earlier this week to share more information about the upcoming Soil Health Clinic to be held on July 18th at the University of Nebraska Eastern Research and Extension Center.
The soil, of course, is one of the foundational components of life on Earth. And for many, we take it for granted. And part of the reason we conduct this training, it's a one-day training, is to give the audience an idea of the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil, which is all part of the soil health world, the soil quality world, if you would. And participants leave really amazed at what all goes on in the soil. And of course, to better manage it, to better utilize it, and to better protect it, we feel it's important that participants have a better understanding of those components of the soil. We have a tremendous working relationship with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, and many of our instructors will be NRCS scientists and professionals, as well as University of Nebraska Extension professionals as well, conducting the training. And whether you're a gardener or you're a corn grower or just an environmentalist who's interested in soil stewardship, this would be an excellent opportunity to better have an understanding of the soil components. So we talk about, first of all, landscape position, and this will be out in the field, by the way. And we talk about landscape position because that's an important factor in the soil forming properties over time. And we also talk about and use different tests that can be used by a landowner, by a farmer, by a gardener, to determine the physical properties of the soil. We'll also have demonstrations and hands-on experiences looking at the biological properties of the soil, as well as understanding pH and parent material and how that influences the soil that we have to work with.
For more information on how to register for the clinic, go to the CropWatch website at cropwatch.unl.edu. Recently, WalletHub.com ranked Nebraska 7th among states with the highest property taxes. Over the past 10 years, Nebraska ag land property taxes have increased by 162%, leading to the introduction of several bills during the 2018 unicameral. However, the majority of the bills, which address property tax relief and reform, were postponed indefinitely and never made it to the governor's desk for approval. You can learn more about these bills and the future of property tax discussions in the July Nebraska Farmer. Japanese beetles are making a return to the eastern side of the state. Nebraska Extension entomologist Bob Wright joined us to discuss the beetle and how to accurately assess the defoliation levels of corn and soybeans.
They've been emerging in eastern Nebraska the last week or so, and now is the time people should be checking their corn and soybean fields for possible injury from these insects.
And it's not just the east anymore, isn't it? It's also starting to appear a little further west.
Right, they've been moving out into Nebraska the past several years. Initially, we had populations in urban areas in Omaha and Lincoln, and a pattern we've seen in a lot of states is they start off in urban areas, and then when the populations build up, they sort of boil over into agricultural areas, and that's what we're seeing in Nebraska.
Any other kind of changes we should look for this year?
Well, so far it seems like the numbers have been pretty good. Again, there'll be some people who haven't seen them in corn and soybeans in the past may see them for the first time this year. They're continuing to spread and distribute themselves across the state, so new infestations are certainly possible. If you haven't had them before, you could have them this year, so check.
And before you're thinking about treatment, you need to look at the entire area, right?
Right. In both corn and soybeans, they tend to build up on the outside, the edges of the fields first. And so if you see a lot of beetles on the edge of the field, don't necessarily assume they're throughout the field, that you need to spray the whole field.
And what kind of treatments are available?
Well, a lot of people are using some of the pyrethroid insecticides or pyrethroids combined with other insecticides. There's multiple products that are available that are effective against Japanese beetles. I guess one of the issues is that the beetles are emerging over a 3 to 4 week period, and then they live for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So we're going to have Japanese beetles around through August, and that often confuses people. They think, boy, they live a long time. It's not so much they live a long time as that they're emerging over, they don't all emerge as adults at one time. They emerge over several weeks, and then they live several weeks. And then they can also move around from field to field as needed.
So it's not something that people should think that they're going to get rid of and they're going to be completely gone.
No, and the Again, they have a very broad host range. The immature stages or white grubs, they can be in brome grass pastures or brome grass roadsides or field ditches. So they're not necessarily living in the crop fields, but there's a lot of habitats that the larvae can develop in.
And you've written an article that appeared in CropWatch that sort of gave a 5-step look at what people should be doing.
Well, there's one issue in soybeans. In terms, the main way we judge whether or not it's going to pay to treat is the defoliation level, leaf loss, and the Japanese beetles tend to feed on the upper newer leaves. And when you walk into the field, you really notice that, and you think, this is terrible. I have lost a lot of leaves in the upper part of the canopy. But to really make a treatment decision, you need to look over the whole canopy. And a lot of our soybeans are in reproductive stages now, and if we have 20% defoliation averaged over the whole canopy, that's a level you want to treat. If we still have some vegetative soybeans, you want to treat before they exceed 30% defoliation. But it takes some practice. The other thing we have on the CropWatch article is some samples of different levels of defoliation. Oftentimes people overestimate the defoliation level, and we have some photos that can help you do a little training so you're ready to know how much defoliation is there. In corn, it's a different issue. The beetles will feed on the leaves as they first emerge, but that's not economic damage. But as soon as the silks start emerging in corn, that's where the Japanese beetles like to feed, and if they're abundant enough, they can interfere with pollination. So just the same with rootworm beetles, we want to check and see how much silk clipping there is. If they've clipped the silks down to the husk level and there's no silks exposed to pick up the pollen, we want to treat in that case. Again, watch on corn. They may be more abundant in the field borders than the whole field.
And just to make it confusing, there's also a false beetle, Japanese beetle out there.
Right, some people are confused. There's another related beetle called the false Japanese beetle or sand chafer. It's mostly found in the Platte River Valley and other areas with a lot of sandy soils. It doesn't feed as much as an adult as the Japanese beetle, so it's a lot less economically damaging. Is colored differently. The Japanese beetle has a metallic green area behind its head, and it has white tufts of hair along the edge of its abdomen. The false Japanese beetle or sand chafer is uniform in color, oftentimes a coppery color, sometimes totally black, but it doesn't have these white tufts of hair, and it's not an economic issue in corn or soybeans in terms of the adult feeding.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast, and during this last week we dealt with the very hot temperatures set in across the central United States and dew point temperatures well into the upper 60s to the mid 70s depending on location. So heat index values were consistently in the 95 to 105 range for the vast majority of this week till we got into Friday with the cold front that moved out of the Dakotas slipping through northern Nebraska and starting to slide southward. Brought some heavy precipitation to southern portions of South Dakota and northern Nebraska, and that front presently is moving its way southward through the state, although it is beginning to wash out. So before we get to the main forecast, with this recent precipitation events, we thought it would be a good idea to bring you up to date on the latest drought monitor. And as we go to the latest drought monitor, I'll draw your attention to the southwest. This has been the persistent area of dryness that we have seen consistently move from the southern plains and build back westward over the last 4 to 5 months and intensify. We do have exceptional to extraordinary drought in this region, showing improvements in the central United States, although some of this is probably overdone. Simply, we had such heavy precipitation events in short time periods, plus we still are carrying 3 to 6 inch deficits over south central Nebraska. So there's probably a longer term drought signal here that's not showing, and a couple of the weeks of below normal precipitation will really start to show its ugly head in terms of the crop response to the lack of moisture. So for today, the upper air pattern has the main jet stream pattern flowing along the Canadian border, and that is expected to slowly change into a trough over the eastern United States. At the surface, we have a low pressure system over north central South Dakota and over southern Kansas. The front that is coming through is depicted to produce some scattered thunderstorm activity across the southeast. I think that's a little bit overplayed, but as we go into tomorrow, start to see this defining trough taking place to the north of us, starting to carve out. High pressure trying to build in, low pressure to our south will actually focus the convergence zone as the secondary cold front starts to move toward the southeast. So we do see some precipitation for western Nebraska, but on Monday, as we see the upper air trough starting to lay a foundation of a pretty significant trough over the Great Lakes, high pressure will continue to push southward, and that will bring the cold front through eastern Nebraska with some monsoon flow over western Nebraska. It looks like some decent chances of precipitation, although scattered in nature, just to the east of Nebraska. So we go into Tuesday, a secondary wave in the upper atmosphere will start to pass through the state, surface low in the Dakotas and one to our south, while to converge moisture into our region, starting off with thunderstorm activity in the western portion of the state, and then that will gradually shift toward the east as we go into Wednesday with that upper air trough starting to make its way toward north central Iowa. Surface low pressure over southeastern Kansas will help to feed the Gulf moisture up into our region, and there's a fairly decent shot of precipitation over Nebraska. This may be a little bit farther north than currently depicted, but right now it looks like a decent shot of moisture. And then we see some pretty significant trough carving itself over the Great Lakes, bringing in cooler than normal conditions across much of the eastern United States, with surface and high pressure moving in from the Canary Prairie Province regions into our region. We'll see thunderstorm activity developing in portions of the central Corn Belt, and then a very steep trough building across the eastern United States as we get into Friday. Very cool conditions to our east with a warming trend to our region. In terms of precipitation, we are probably looking at most of the significant moisture isolated over the Great Lakes region, with a drier pattern establishing itself to the east. So we are going to gradually stay cooler than normal through the end of next week before a warming trend continues. If we look at 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we see the cooler than normal conditions followed by drier than normal conditions that look to be consistent through the remainder of the month.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, guidelines for harvesting alfalfa in high temperatures, the upcoming soil health clinic, and Japanese beetles. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Elaine Cubb, author of Mastering the Grain Markets, will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jerry Renaud, and we'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.